Welcome to Wheatbelt NRM in the Field, where every month we bring you the latest and greatest discussions on the environment, soil health, and local expert advice from right across the region. Explore the fascinating and ever-evolving world of the Wheatbelt, home to plant and animal species found nowhere else on the planet, and dive into practical, on-the-ground farming insights shaped by the landscapes we work in. My name's Amy Moritz, and I'll be your host for today. And in today's episode of Get the Dirt, our series on soil, we're joined by Professor Richard Bell from Murdoch University
and the Soil CRC
to discuss his project, New Farming Methods to Sequester Soil Carbon, Reduce Greenhouse Gas Emissions, and Improve Soil Fertility.
The project includes several long-term trials that are part of the Soil CRC's broader research activities and that have received additional funding from the West Australian Government and from the Australian Government's Future Drought Fund.
Thanks for joining us, Richard.
You're welcome. Yeah, looking forward to it.
So, Richard, when we talk about your project, New Farming Methods to Store More Soil Carbon, what does that look like in practical terms for Wheatbelt growers?
The first thing I would say is that we need to recognise that soil organic carbon is continually breaking down. Something like 2% of soil organic matter would break down in a year. So our first aim is just to hold those levels steady. And so we shouldn't underestimate the importance of that. Storing more carbon, you're already on the back foot because even if you do nothing, you're losing carbon year by year. Now, in general terms, if you want to increase soil organic carbon, there are four things that you can focus on. One is slow down decomposition. And of course, no-till was probably the biggest thing that we did to slow down decomposition. But adding clay is another way in which farmers currently try to store more carbon by slowing down decomposition. And in our project, we've also been looking at some other novel products as an alternative to subsoil clay, which I can talk about during this podcast. So that's the first thing, slow down decomposition. Second is increasing external inputs, and that could be compost or manures if they're available. And transport costs are always a big factor to consider with those sorts of organic inputs, and where they make sense economically, where they're available, then that's definitely something that you can do. And I know, for example, there are piggeries, there are poultry operations scattered around the Wheatbelt, and so for some people that's quite a accessible resource that they could think about. Third one is increasing crop biomass, that is, grow more carbon on the soil. That relates to many of the innovations around soil management, the re-engineering, for example, overcoming soil constraints so that you produce a bigger crop and you harvest a bigger crop, but you also leave more biomass from crop stubbles as well as the root system, and that is beneficial to soil carbon as well. And then the final point is often the topsoil of the upper 5, even 10 centimetres may be already relatively saturated in carbon, and so to build more carbon, you often have to think about how you can get it into the subsoil. So those are general principles. In terms of new farming methods to store more carbon, claying is obviously one. Arguable whether it's new. It's been around now for some time. Well practiced in the South Coast and increasingly in the Midlands and central ag regions. Subsoil amendments, getting lime into the subsoil to overcome subsoil acidity so you grow a bigger crop. That's part of new farming approaches that are now getting fairly widespread. As I said, things like compost, manures, there will be niche situations where they're locally available in reasonable quantities that farmers can think about using those on their farm, but it may not be a solution for everyone because, one, there may not be enough, and two, if you transport those too far, then the transport costs start to make it difficult to make money from that type of amendment. And in our project, we have been looking at, are there any other novel products that you could use that might help soil carbon storage by any one of those four approaches that I mentioned. So, for example, we have used bentonite clay in some of our experiments, and bentonite is mined at Watheroo, so it is available to some people, and it's a much more clay-rich material than subsoil is, so potentially you wouldn't have to add as much of it. We've looked at Ironman gypsum, which is a clay-type product from mineral sands processing, quite rich in iron oxides, and the iron oxides do tend to complex with carbon, and that might be one way of slowing down decomposition. We looked at zeolite, which is a crushed rock with very high surface area, and we've looked at hydrotalcite, which is it's a synthetic clay mineral that's different from the rest of clays. Almost all clays and soils are negatively charged, and so they'll hold on to cations, calcium, magnesium, potassium, which are positively charged. So you get that electrostatic bond between the negative and the positive. Hydrotalcite has a positive charge, so potentially it can hold on to negative ions in the soil, nitrate, phosphate, sulfate. And so that's something else that we've been looking at, just to see, is there anything out there that we haven't tried that has a potential role in more fertile soils that store more carbon and grow more biomass and a higher yield with a profit margin that makes them attractive.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. So from the trials, did you see anything that really stood out to you as showing the most promise for sequestering soil carbon and improving soil fertility? And also another question I had, a bit of a double prong question: were all your sites in sandy soils, or did you have a variable soil texture over the trial sites?
To answer the last question first, we focused on sands, but not all sands are the same. I can talk about 3 experiments that we've done, but they're all on different types of sands in different climatic regions. And so you have to think about the site-specific constraints as well as the benefits. At this stage, what I can talk about is the responses that we got at a particular site and the soils that it might relate to, without generalising too far beyond that at this stage. So we had one experiment in the West Midlands, and that was on a red loamy sand. So not all the soils in the West Midlands are of that type, and this one might be considered one of the more fertile or productive of the sands. There are deep pale sands and yellow sands that are lower productivity, and there are gravelly soils, which farmers and advisors in that area tell me they've got some pretty good ways of managing those soils now to increase their productivity. But this one, it's in a good rainfall zone. Probably the main constraint is water repellence and possibly some subsoil compaction from machinery. So there we've found a good response to deep tillage, both moldboarding and spading. And of course that's now pretty widely used by farmers on sands in the West Midlands and the Northern Sand Plains. Compost, we also got quite a good response in that trial to about 10 tonnes of a good quality compost. There we think the benefits are coming mostly from improved nutrient uptake. So it seems to be you've got a high yield potential, and those amendments, the tillage and the compost, able to improve the nutrient use efficiency there. Second site is at Quader, which is East Pingelly, so central Wheatbelt, sandy duplex soil with acid subsoil. We don't think there's any major subsoil compaction at that site. There we've tried a number of things. We didn't get a response to compost there at 5 tonnes. The response we're getting is to deep tillage, and the tillage that we've used is a Bednar Terralander, which has a ripping or delving type implement that gets down to 40 centimetres, and then a roller with spikes on it that does some mixing of the topsoil. So we think that at that site we're probably getting incorporation of the lime into the subsoil, and that's probably the main benefit that we're getting at that particular site. And then the third experiment is Bellaring, so north of Wickerpin, a deep sand. It's not acid. And in that area, there are a lot of pockets of deep sands which might occupy several hectares. So it's not the whole paddock like in the Midlands. And their farmers are trying to manage these deep sands in association with better quality soils. And so it's trying to work out what's a suitable management package that enables you to not lose money, basically, on the deep sands and not lose them through wind erosion or other degradation. There, so far, the best treatment that we've had in terms of yield increase is where you're rotating with legumes, and it was a mixture of lupin and vetch, which seems to increase the nitrogen uptake in the following year. But interestingly, on the same experiment, ceradella hasn't produced the same benefit. And I'm aware of some recent work that deep herd scientists have done where they're showing that the decomposition rate of the ceradellas much slower than things like lupin and vetch, and that may explain why the lupin-vetch mix is releasing the nitrogen more quickly, and you're getting a nitrogen uptake benefit from it was canola in this case on that site. So it's horses for courses. You've got to understand what sand you're dealing with, what are the constraints, and then look at what amendments, whether it's rotations of crops, tillage, fertilizer, is the best fit. But interestingly, in those 3 experiments, which are now going into 5-6 years, when we measured soil organic carbon after 3 to 4 years, we weren't able to measure any significant increases in soil organic carbon there. So that really speaks to the need for long-term investigations here. I can frame this with a bit of basic soil knowledge here that 1% soil organic carbon in 0 to 10 centimetres is 13 tonnes of soil organic carbon.
Per hectare.
Per hectare.
Is it?
So 0.1% soil organic carbon is 1.3 tonnes per hectare. So keep that in mind. Now, as a ballpark figure, whenever you add soil organic carbon to the soil, 80% of it is probably lost through decomposition, goes back into the atmosphere. You hold on to, say, 20% of that. So that means that even if we want to increase the soil organic carbon by 0.1%, we're going to have to add 6 or 7 tonnes of extra carbon. And if you think about that in terms of farming systems and the sort of treatments that we apply, unless we're able to find or add or produce that extra amount of carbon in the system, then it's going to be a slow grind building up carbon, and therefore we need long-term experiments to be able to test the effects. So pretty fortunate through the Soil CRC that we've been able to set up these 3 experiments, and we've got enough funding that we'll be able to keep them going for 6, 7, 8 years. And so I think we're in there with a shot of being able to see whether we can measure increases in soil organic carbon. Something else that's worth keeping in mind is that 0.1% soil organic carbon, it's not easy to measure. If you think about soil variability in the field. So that's something else that you've got to bear in mind, that some of these gains that we're looking for are long-term and not that easy to measure.
So last month we did a podcast with Dr. Mehran Rushdie, who is also doing a soil CRC project from Griffith University, and he was working on a project around soil resilience. So very, very similar to the project that you guys are working on. So yeah, one of the keys that we got out of speaking to him was about soil organic carbon at depth. So in the root zone, that's the key that they got, is when you're building soil organic carbon in the root zone, it's more likely to stay in the system, to be sequestered and not be cycled as much as the topsoil. So I'm just thinking along the lines of, when you're doing these soil amendments, where were they placed in the soil profile? Were they put on the top and just harrowed in, or were they actually deep ripped in during the ripping phase, or with a spader, or how were they actually practically put into the soil?
Well, before I answer that, the carbon in roots does seem to decompose more slowly, and stabilizes, transitions or transforms into soil organic matter more effectively than above ground biomass. So that relates to what I said earlier. If you can grow bigger crops, more biomass, you're also growing more roots into the soil, which is part of the benefit and the potential for increasing soil organic carbon. Now, at the Quetta site, I mentioned we use the Bednar Terralander, which is mixing up to 40 centimetres, although the real mixing of topsoil is probably 20 to 30 centimetres. And then at the West Midlands site, which was at Bothangarra, we actually had different methods of incorporation: moldboarding, which is getting down to 30 centimetres, spading similar, as well as just a shallow incorporation and a no-till. And we did look at whether there's a positive interaction between mixing and compost. Haven't seen it. So you get a benefit from the deep tillage, the spading, the moldboarding, a benefit from the composting, but when you add them together, it's just the added gains. You don't get anything extra above the addition of 1 + 1 = 2.
Yeah, fair enough. That makes sense. So obviously you'll be looking closely at the end of trial soil analysis for soil carbon, and you'll be able to analyse that further, whether there has been change over time, over the 6 or 7 years of the project.
Yeah. So this year we're not doing intensive soil sampling. We did that last year, and next year we'll do another more intensive soil sampling to see what the gains are, if any, in soil organic carbon.
Excellent. So that sort of leads me nicely into my next question, which is about another one of our projects. So we've just embarked on the National Soils Monitoring Project. We've taken about 50 samples of 450, which will be taken over the southwest of Western Australia over the next year or two. And so as a part of that, we survey our landholders to ask them land use questions about, no-till, do they use no-till practices, herbicides, just general land use questions. Do you think there's any other relevant questions that we should ask our landholders to understand their land use and how that's going to affect their soil carbon and soil resilience into the future?
Well, obviously some of those big engineering changes in soils, whether it's spading, moldboard, ploughing, delving, ripping, all of those things that can either mix carbon in different parts of the profile or bring up clay or mix clay in the topsoil with the potential of trapping or holding more carbon into the soil. Rotations obviously significant. We've gone in the southwest across the Wheatbelt from 60% pasture, 40% crop to the other way round, 60% crop, 40% pasture. And so that is changing the ability to use legume pasture phases to rebuild soil carbon. There's less opportunity for that to happen. So I think those would be some of the big things to look at.
Yeah, so the tricky part now for our landholders is accessing those amendments, and nobody really wants to start on an ambitious soils tillage project right now with the price of fuel the way it is and access to fertilizers being greatly reduced. Suggestions of 30% access on, previously other years access hasn't been an issue, although increased cost of inputs is definitely of concern. So how do people, obviously when you're going to build biomass, you want a high yielding, high biomass crop. You're going to have to add some sort of fertilizer, chemical fertilizer, which is what most people are using. So what would you, a lot of people have already embarked on soils projects to try and build their soil resilience over time. But for those people that are just starting out, in order to not completely lose hope that they've missed the boat, do you have any suggestions around the technicalities of improving efficiency on farm?
Look, I guess we're hoping that this year is a aberration in terms of availability and price of fertiliser inputs. But we do run a farming system, particularly the cropping systems, where we're taking out nutrients in grain and exporting them elsewhere. We are recycling some of those nutrients in crop stubbles and in the root systems, but you can't continue to run down those systems without topping up with the appropriate amount of fertilizer. And one that is perhaps was under the radar, but I think more and more farmers are now looking at potassium, and because for a long time we've been taking off more potassium than has been going back in. And if the soil starts out with very high potassium levels, as some of the loamy and clay-rich soils do, then you can run that strategy for a long, long time. But on the soils that have borderline potassium storage, then that rundown will eventually catch up with you. That's something that's worth keeping in mind, that you can't run down nutrients in the long term and expect there to be no consequence. Something else that I think is becoming more standard practice is splitting nitrogen. That it's not that long ago that a lot of nitrogen just went down at seeding, and some farmers in the high rainfall or higher yield potential areas would put down a second split application. But I was talking to a farmer from the Midlands recently where they're talking about 8 splits of nitrogen fertilizer during the crop. So if you can work that into the system and make it pay, and obviously with the high price of diesel, it might not be quite as attractive a proposition, but that split application is obviously a way of increasing the use efficiency of nitrogen, which is still pretty low. I think the recent research that Louise Barton has been doing suggests that, we're still a long way from being able to get all of the nitrogen fertilizer put out back into the crop, that there are still significant losses out there.
So that would be would that split application, say if you were doing up to 8 applications a year, would that be via liquid nitrogen, would be the most efficient?
Yes, I think that's what we're talking about. And of course, spraying out liquids, you can get across a lot of ground very quickly and probably not burning as much diesel as if you're using heavier machinery to put out larger rates. And you may be able to combine that with sprays for insects, disease, weeds.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's these kind of efficiencies that have been developed, and farmers have taken these technologies in the last 15 years that has helped our cropping systems become so successful, which, I mean, there's no doubt that they've gone from strength to strength and on very little rainfall a lot of the time. So, yeah, we do have amazing farmers.
Yeah, indeed. 4 out of the last 5 years have produced record yields across the state, and they weren't all fantastic years.
Yeah. So seeing as our growers are working on so many different soil types, from deep white sands to heavy clay, you sort of touched on this question before. How do you see the soil type and the texture affecting soil carbon sequestration?
It's one of the 3 factors that affect how much soil carbon there is. If you look across Australian soils, it's rainfall, temperature, and clay. Those are the 3 factors that explain across the continent the variation in soil carbon. So obviously more rainfall, you produce more biomass, bigger crops, they recycle more carbon into the soil. High temperatures can burn off carbon more quickly. So that's, even between the northern ag region and the south coast, the difference in temperature across the season is reasonably significant, and that can have a impact on how quickly the carbon decomposes. And finally, clay. And clay is about locking onto carbon and reducing the amount of decomposition, slowing decomposition, building aggregates or soil structure, and that tends to protect the carbon in the soil. And also clay soils, all things being equal, would probably generally be higher productivity soils. Probably the only exception to that would be in very dry years where water availability in the sands might end up producing a better yield than on clays. So those 3 factors explain variation in carbon across the country. So what we're looking at is increasing clay in sands. That's one strategy that you can use to increase the carbon storage. As I mentioned, the clay physically binds carbon, but it also builds structure, and the change in pore sizes in the soil PEDs or aggregates is more favourable for carbon storage. But sands will always have a lower potential for soil organic carbon storage compared to loams and clays. Burying topsoil will slow down the rate of decomposition of that carbon because lower in the profile there's less oxygen and less disturbance, so that carbon will tend to break down more slowly. But in order to bury it, you've caused some disturbance, and that will just the trade-off between more storability of the carbon and accelerating the breakdown of some of that carbon. Not sure how that plays out on a site-by-site basis. Yeah, and anything that you can do on site to increase biomass through alleviating other constraints, acidity, water repellents, compaction, all of that is just putting more carbon back into the soil so that even if it is a sand, you're maximising the amount of carbon that you're storing.
Yeah, so for our landholders who may have a very deep patch of sand which they are noticing is constantly underperforming, and considering the fact that it's going to cost them a lot to ameliorate paddocks like that, and it may never yield as highly as some of their more loamy paddocks. Have you considered, I'm thinking about soil carbon projects now versus, say, planting trees for a carbon project. Would you consider that to be an option in certain situations, that people are just better off, say, fencing off an area and planting it to trees or fodder crops or something they can get another benefit from?
Potentially, yes. I'm not sure that I've seen the numbers on a rigorous analysis of how that plays out. And of course, part of the unknown is the price of carbon. So if we had stable or more predictable carbon markets, I think farmers would be in a better position to know whether that is a payoff strategy, just to, as you say, fence off some of those regions and plant them with a tree or shrub and minimise their losses in the cropping phase and stabilise the site, get some benefit from carbon in the long term.
Yeah, we're obviously, being a natural resource management organisation, we're always looking for ways to get more plants in the ground and biodiversity and improve biodiversity. So jumping back over to the National Soils Monitoring Program, how important do you think monitoring, like we're taking samples down to 1 metre as a part of the National Soils Monitoring Program, how important is it that we've got that data to understand the trends that are happening over time and looking at that over low rainfall years, high rainfall years, different land uses? Is that, do you see that as an important part of knowing what's happening in soil resilience?
Absolutely. I mean, in the best case scenario, as I mentioned earlier, we're probably still looking at relatively small increases in carbon. And we know that in our rain-fed environment, you get big year-to-year fluctuations in rainfall and productivity. So you've got that variability, and therefore you need long-term data to tease out what the trends are. 1 or 2 years is not likely to be able to tease apart what's an actual land use or treatment effect from just an annual variation. But of course, you need reliable methods of sampling, and there are standard ways of doing that. Pleased to see that you're going to a metre depth, because not all the carbon, we do have very large areas in the Wheatbelt of deep weathered regoliths, which in places might be going down to 30 metres. Richard Harper at Murdoch University has actually done some research showing that even though the concentration of carbon in that very deep regolith is low, if you add up all the bits of carbon down to 5, 10, 20 metres, there's quite a lot of carbon there. And so going down to a metre, I don't expect you to be sampling to 20 metres, but going down to a metre I think is a good move, just to see how stable that carbon is down there. Because, I mean, our agricultural land, some of it was only cleared 50 years ago?
Yeah, 1960s, a lot of it. Yep.
Yeah, and so there could still be changes happening in subsoil carbon that we don't really have a handle on. And obviously, the holy grail with this sort of monitoring is to be able to collect lots of samples at depth very cheaply and with reliable methods. And I think, there's a lot of research going on to see whether it's possible to get that cheap, reliable methodology going so that we can, even 450 samples sounds like a lot, but covering 20 million hectares, you can quickly see there could be some gaps there.
Yeah, certainly. I'm feeling that at the moment. It's every site is a challenge and has its own challenges. So yeah, more technologies in that space would be incredible to be able to more quickly and easily analyze what's happening in the soil. So I think, Richard, we brushed over a little bit the benefits of having soil carbon in the system. So you obviously are monitoring that in your trials. So just for the layman who might be listening, what would you see what are the benefits of having higher soil carbon rates in your soils?
The soil carbon is really an engine of many beneficial processes in the soil. And so we actually want the soil carbon pool to be quite active. So we don't just want to hoard it. And in fact, the soil quality study that Dan Murphy and colleagues have done, 1,000 sites across the Wheatbelt, shows that actually when the pH drops below 5.5, start to increase more carbon storage in the soil. And that's because as the soil is more acid, it's not as biologically active, and that carbon does tend to remain in the soil. But that's not actually what we want. We want a soil that's biologically active, turning over nutrients, where there's enough biodiversity in the microorganisms that you get some suppression of disease organisms and the like, and that the organic matter is also helping to store nutrients and then release them in a slower fashion through the season so that you get less losses. Yeah, so it's trying to get that sweet spot of storing, but also not having an inert soil organic matter that's not providing these beneficial functions. We also talk about the role of soil organic matter in storing water in the soil. And it is true that soil organic matter, every kilo of soil organic matter can store up to about a kilo of water. And that sounds like it's a great benefit, but I recently read a international meta-analysis that looked at what's the relationship between increasing soil organic matter and increasing soil water storage. And the conclusion was that 1% increase in soil organic matter can increase soil water storage by just over 1 millimetre. It's next to nothing, actually. And 1% soil organic matter is a lot to increase.
I can't imagine that, getting that anywhere in the Wheatbelt.
Yeah, so from a theoretical point of view, yes, soil organic matter does hold on to water, and increasing it should increase the water storage, but let's not overstate the benefits because they're not huge for the amounts of soil organic matter that we're talking about.
Yeah, and also the clay can do the same thing. It holds more water storage in loams rather than sands.
It does, and the upside, clays per unit weight, clays don't hold as much water as organic matter, but they still, let's say 40% of the weight of clay can be held as extra water. The upside of the clay, of course, is you're adding huge rates. If you're adding 200, 300 tons of subsoil, and that's 35% clay, which is probably quite reasonable, you're adding quite a lot of clay, and therefore the water storage capacity of that is more significant. And I think Gus Azam's research with their re-engineering to depth, they're showing you might be able to increase water storage by 10, 20 mils with the extra clay. And if you're getting an extra 20 kilos of grain for each mill, you're talking about, 200, 400 kilograms extra grain yield from that benefit. Yeah, so that the claying, we can readily see how that translates into more water storage, which increases yield potential. The organic matter benefit, be a bit cautious about making wild claims of the increase in water storage from increased soil organic matter.
Yeah. So did you do costings on your amendments? Has that been a part of the project, is looking at the cost of all the different amendments?
It is. We're still in the process of doing those analyses. We've got a colleague at University of Newcastle, Professor Frank Agbola, in the soil CRC, and he's come on board to do that analysis on our 3 long-term trials in Western Australia, as well as some other trials in Victoria, New South Wales. And obviously that's the big question that growers are going to be asking. What's it going to pay off? And one of our trials, for example, the Credit trial, in 4 years, we've got significant yield increases in year 1 and year 4, but it wasn't a significant increase in year 2 and 3. So we'll be very interested to see the economic analysis of that. Just how does that work? Is that still a profitable outcome? And then this year, which will be year 5, if we get another improvement in yield, how would that work? And if we got a yield increase in year 2, would that make it a payoff proposition rather than having to wait until year 4 before we get the next yield increase?
Could that be related to the crop that was grown at that site on that year?
Could be. Yeah, no, we haven't. The second year was a canola crop. The third year was a lupin crop. So, it could be the crops that were grown in those years that affected the outcome.
Yeah. So for growers wanting to improve natural soil fertility, rely less on chemical fertilizers without taking a huge risk and costing them too much money, what are 1 or 2 management changes you'd recommend would be easily doable to start trying on farm?
Look, I'm a great believer in soil testing. And not just 0 to 10 centimetre tests, but getting down at least to 30 centimetres and having some soil test information down to 50, even 70 centimetres, so that you've got a good understanding of the soil profile that you're dealing with and the full suite of constraints and beneficial properties that are in the soil. Then you look at your fertilizer program and your lime program and whether you're doing ripping, spading, moldboarding, and sit with a good agronomist and just try and work out where is the best payoff there in terms of, do I need to add more lime or should I simply spend the money on spading or moldboarding to mix that lime deeper so it's actually working better rather than putting on more lime or more fertilizer? Let's see if we can get more root growth in the subsoil by mixing that lime deeper and removing subsoil compaction. It's always, to me, about looking at what are the most likely limiting factors and what's the best investment to alleviate those. And then once you've overcome the most limiting factor, you'll probably find those others that you can begin to work on. But the most limiting one will usually be where you get the biggest payoff from investment.
Yeah, well, that's really great advice, Richard. For people to understand what their constraints are to start with is the first step in the process of trying to remove those constraints for better agronomic practices. So, yeah, I think we're about at our time. So thank you so much for joining us today and talking about your project and your insights into soil carbon and soil fertility. Today's episode was supported by the Cooperative Research Centre for High Performance Soils, and that work is supported by Cooperative Research Centre for High Performance Soils, which is funded by the Australian Government's Cooperative Research Centres program. So I'll be really excited to hear about the outcomes of your project, Richard, and the costings, and looking forward to seeing. I've seen a couple of the sites, so it'll be really good to see them at the end of the project and hear the outcomes. But thanks for joining us.
Thanks for the opportunity. Always happy to share what we're finding out. We are involved in long-term studies, and so some of these things we just have to be patient and wait. Hopefully in another year or so we'll be able to get together and give an update on what are the promising findings, and which ones look like they would make money, as well as ensure sustainable soil management in the WA Wheatbelt.
We will certainly look forward to that.